Okay, I'll admit it. My poses are not dynamic right now, and I know that, so we're gonna try and fix it today. I've been a bit frustrated with how simple my poses have looked for a while. It's not that I'm not trying, but having a character who's just standing around, it's not exactly interesting to look at, right? So I thought, well, why not try and solve that with an art study? And who better to study for dynamic poses than Gege Akutami, the creator of Jujutsu Kaisen? What's really cool about him is that you can actually tell, just by analyzing his poses, that he's actually choreographing the entire fight. It's not a situation where you can imagine the character accidentally skipping twice on one foot in order to get into the next position. You can actually imagine from one frame to the next of how the character would move in their body and in the weight from one position to the next. All that said, anatomy and dynamic poses, from what I've seen, are more often about practice than about studying a specific artist. So this is probably not going to be the last time that I study dynamic poses, and I'm not imagining I'm going to get to perfection with just a single art study. But to try and tackle that, I've broken this art study into 3 stages. First, I'm going to be imitating Gege Akutami's art. Then, I'm going to be imitating photo references. And lastly, I'm going to be working on creating my own pose without a perfect reference. So without further ado, let's get started. In this first stage, like I said, I'm imitating. I'm copying it, but not tracing. I do also need to improve my eyes as an artist. That's also an important thing that I need to do over time. So what I'm doing is looking at the pose and trying to recreate it separately. I'm not going to be rendering, I'm not going to be coloring. I'm just going to see how the pose that I made lines up with the original at the end. For each of the poses that I'm doing, I'm basically taking 2 steps. First, I'm doing a quick rough sketch just to get the sense of the line of action, where the head is in relation to the torso, things like that. Then I'm going back in with gray and black shapes to make an actual pose. Nothing too clean. I'm not going into full detail, and I'm not making the individual fingers and hands and things like that, just the rough shapes. For this one, I feel like I got some parts of it wrong. I think the shoulder ended up being a little bit too far to the left on his torso, and I also just didn't expect the arms, both of them, to be that close to the torso itself or to the rest of the body, so I ended up having to adjust those in the end. I also didn't expect the head to be that close to the body. I think it's because the neck and the torso are a bit more complex than I was initially realizing. I often end up making the neck a separate element from the torso, but I may need to change that going forward. I was also a little bit surprised by the hand sizes because I kind of expected the frontmost hand, the right hand holding the butcher knife, to be bigger because of the perspective. And it is bigger, it's just not that much bigger. It's not that exaggerated. Or at least it's not as exaggerated as I thought, I guess. Overall, a fun pose to start off with, and we love Nanamine, so of course. Now for the next one, doing the iconic image of Gojo floating midair, I was unfortunately much further off with this one than the last. I don't know if it's just because he's upside down or if it's just a really difficult pose to draw, but that's just how it turned out. Specifically though, the head was a little bit off in both size and position. I honestly didn't realize how much of the head was covering the back of the shoulders. His right leg, the one that's hidden behind his other leg, was also very off. I kind of thought that one of the clothing folds was his kneecap showing through a little bit, but clearly that was wrong. I think his left thigh is literally just blocking the entire upper half of his right leg. In this case, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me with the hands again, and I made the left hand a little bit smaller than what I thought I was looking at, but I was wrong. I guess to make this pose more dynamic, maybe Gege made the left hand a little bit bigger and chose not to do that as much with Nanamine's pose because it wasn't as necessary, because that pose was really dynamic. All that said, can we just talk about how stick thin Gojo is? His left ankle is, I mean, how can he hold up his entire body with that? That's just too tiny. He needs to gain some weight if he was still alive. Spoilers. Well, it's been out for a while. The next one was tough, to say the least. First of all, baggy clothing made things a big challenge because honestly, it's hard to tell where his body ends and where empty space and clothing begins. On top of that, I think that whenever Gege draws Yuji, he emphasizes kind of blocky hands and feet, which end up making them look a little bit bigger, and so it's a little bit difficult to get the proportions quite right. But most importantly, if you get the torso even a little bit off, you're gonna get everything else off as well. It makes sense, because everything is kind of attached to the torso, so you're not gonna be able to get the shoulders right, so you're not gonna get the elbows right, so you're not gonna get the wrists right, etc. But, all things considered, still fun to do. Wish I could have done things a little bit better, but I think there were just a few different elements involved that made this one a little bit more difficult than I would have liked. If you can't tell, I'm raising the difficulty of the poses each time. In this case, we've got a lot of body parts being covered by other body parts, a lot of foreshortening, a lot of baggy clothing again, and a really weird angle with the head. I definitely got the head wrong, both in terms of the head size and the position, possibly because I feel like his shoulders might be a little bit tensed up in the moment. On top of that, because of the way his body is twisting, I got the hips off as well, which meant that the legs were off. Overall, it ended up being okay, but it's those little details, just the little changes with the torso and the hips that end up making everything else just end up being a little off. I went into this one knowing it was going to be a lot harder than the others. We've got the baggy clothes, we've got one leg completely covered by the rest of his body, we've got the right arm being covered by the head, and again, the weird shoulder to head position. I did catch myself with the positioning of the leg and the left arm, particularly in terms of how they aligned. As I mentioned, the baggy clothes were gonna be a challenge no matter what, but I do think that it ends up making his kicks look a little bit heavier, and I think that that was a very clever design choice by Gege. I do think the hips ended up being off a little bit because of the baggy pants as well. I ended up overshooting how small the hips were in contrast to the pant leg. That said, it was a lot better than I expected. I think I could really feel the weight in his shoulders with the way his arms are bending, and the momentum of his leg is still lifting him up a little bit, but you can definitely see what areas of his body are weighing him down in this moment. Overall, I had a really fun time imitating Gege's poses, and I think it's now time to move on to real-life poses and see what I can do with that. As I mentioned before, Stage 2 is very similar to Stage 1. I'm still imitating a pose, but this time I'm focusing on a real person's reference photo. This means I can't rely on clear line art to figure out where the edges should go, and I can't rely on Gege's exaggeration to make it look good. Just like in the last section, if I got the torso wrong, I would end up getting the entire pose wrong. But in this case, I just got the shoulders wrong, so the arms ended up being at the wrong angle. Overall though, I did a pretty good job, though I did have to catch myself with the front legs bend angle. I don't think that my pose has quite as much energy or tension, in part because of the errors, but also in part because I didn't render it, and I also just didn't exaggerate things in the way that Gege Akutami would have. This was good practice, but I still have room for improvement. This one was a little bit harder than I expected all around. I got a lot of the lengths wrong and a lot of the angles wrong. For example, I angled her head a little bit off, and her head was too small. Similarly, I got her left shin a little bit off in terms of the angle. Her knee should have been moving farther forward than her foot, and I didn't realize that until much later when I was comparing the two images. I also made the arms too long compared to the legs, even after shortening them, and I made the shoulders a bit too wide as well. It's hard to tell, though, how wide they should be because her back and shoulder muscles are in such a weird position, and her hair is covering one half of her upper torso. I honestly thought this pose was going to be a little bit easier than the last one, but it really was not. I really thought this pose was going to be easier, but unfortunately it just isn't intuitive. For one, I got the lean of the torso wrong. The angle's just off, and I could have probably realized it if I had checked where her head ended and where her knee is. Just checking a vertical line there. She could have been leaning farther forward, really. On top of that, I kept having to adjust the torso because I ended up making it too skinny, and I didn't get the arm and shoulder muscles quite right in terms of their shape. I didn't realize how much they would stretch outward and make this kind of triangular shape. And lastly, although the legs were mostly accurate in length and angle, the left foot, our right side, her left, it was just not right. It wasn't correct because the foreshortening of feet continues to be difficult for me. And I'll be honest, I don't want to yuck anyone's yum, but I really don't want to have to make an art study about feet. I'm probably going to have to eventually. So far, I'm just avoiding it by trying to keep the feet blocked or off camera, that kind of thing, but I'm running away from my responsibilities and I need to approach it sometime. So I guess if you like feet, look forward to that in the future. Now on to the last imitation pose before the real deal. For this one, I knew I wanted to choose a pose where the person is falling or floating in some way because, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, that's going to be important for the final one that I'm doing without references. I don't know why, but I keep making the head too big. I don't know if it's because I've read too much manga, watched too much anime, and all the heads are just a little bit too big, or what, but I gotta work on that. When I saw the upper left forearm, the one that's kind of falling back, I noticed how it was super foreshortened, and I ended up overcorrecting a little bit. So I ended up having to adjust that later on. One thing I noticed is that with the high hip rise, I ended up lowering her legs on her hips too much without realizing it. Overall, though, I was only really slightly off with the other arms and legs, and not in a particularly meaningful way. It still looks like the reference. I do think I could have made her hips a little bit bigger, but I think for the sake of the pose, I don't hate it. I got the general gist. There are some slight changes that need to be made. I'm actually pretty happy with this one overall, and I'm glad that it wasn't as frustrating as the last one. So now it's on to the very last pose that doesn't have a single reference that I can just imitate. It's a combination of a bunch of different references that I got off of Pexels. For this one, I'm drawing Elijah, a character who very desperately wants to join social tea party circles rather than being cooped up in his study where he has to do a lot of paperwork. Unlike my previous few art pieces, which are a little bit more on the realistic side, this one is definitely more artsy-fartsy, I guess. I guess that's pretty millennial of me to say, but, forgive me for it. I knew this pose was going to be a little bit of a challenge because I didn't have a clear reference, and also, I've never drawn someone really properly floating before, so I knew that things like the hair and the clothing were going to be not super easy. On top of that, I ended up actually making a change in my plan. You see, when I was originally blocking out the piece and figuring out where I wanted things to go before actually making the drawing, I had planned on having him being shown from the side completely. But then after doing this study, I decided that I wanted to make it a little bit more dynamic and have him be at a slight angle, facing a little bit more towards the imaginary camera. This means foreshortening, which if you haven't noticed, I'm not very good at, and I could probably do more practice on. But I'm not gonna run away from it, I'm gonna try. In the end, I think I did an okay job. I had to keep messing with the legs a little bit, and I just gave up on the feet. It's not happening this time. It's just not. I'm not gonna mess with it. It is what it is. I put placeholders and that is good enough. I also think this time I learned my lesson when it comes to heads and where they are located compared to the shoulder, the torso, the back, that sort of situation. I did have to mess around with it a little bit in terms of the size still, but overall I think it ended up being pretty good. All of that being said, I do think that there's a lot of room for me to grow still when it comes to anatomy and dynamic poses. And I'm not just talking about feet, I mean really just foreshortening and how the head proportions work compared to everything else. All of it. There's a lot more to learn. So don't go thinking this is gonna be the last that you see of me doing art studies around poses and things like that. It's gonna have to happen again, and I probably won't be doing it quite so soon, just because I need a break from this. My next art study is definitely not going to be about dynamic poses and anatomy, because there are still other things that I would like to learn, and I would like to balance things out so I don't get too tired of it. But all in all, this was really good methodical practice for me. I really am feeling like I learned a little bit more. I feel a little bit more comfortable with kind of the volume of the torso and where the head should go and things like that. I think the next time I cover dynamic poses and movement and anatomy in an art study, I might want to choose something from real life that is actively moving, so something like a video of a person dancing. I do feel like some of the images that I ended up picking, the photos, were staged in such a way that they felt a little stiff, especially the dance ones from the very start. I think I'll get more out of it if I learn about how the body moves more than just how the body is. I think that's a key takeaway from Gege Akutami's style. So maybe I should pick something like a dance video or a music video of some kind, because that's going to have a lot of different body movements, a lot of different dynamic angles and things like that. And also, it gives me an excuse to draw ATs, who I have a huge rabbit hole fixation about right now, so it would work and make sense for me. But let me know what you think, because if you have other recommendations for dancing artists that I should check out, I'll definitely at least take a look. No guarantees that I'll end up drawing them, because my brain just doesn't work that way. Alrighty, well I think that's enough for this. Thanks for stopping by. If you liked it, leave a like and a comment. I would appreciate it. And if you liked this video and you want to see more things like it, I encourage you to hit the subscribe button, because I'm going to be doing a few more art studies from now on, because I'm shifting from a 2-month schedule to a 3-month schedule for all of my themes, which means we're going to go art study, time-lapse, art study, time-lapse, art study, etc., etc., etc. Alrighty, well, thank you. Bye-bye.